Hello comrades. This is gonna be a video about the results of the first and second 5-year plans of the Soviet Union. And I got the idea for this video because I happen to have all these stats and all these statistics, and I was originally just gonna make a blog post about these and just put them out there. But then I started looking at them, and there's actually quite a number of things that I think require explanation and context to understand what's even going on in the stats. And also, there's some stats and some numbers which are really fascinating, so I thought that I should make a video about it. I did make a blog post about it, I'll link it in the description, and that's basically what I'm gonna be reading off of in this video, for the most part. I know my blog isn't very active, I don't post there very often, but this is one of those rare instances when I actually wrote something for my blog. But anyway, let's just get on with the video. So, in these economics statistics, there are 4 basic periods which are depicted in these stats, time periods, years. So firstly, we have the Tsarist census of 1913. This represents the height of economic development of the Russian Empire, because the economy of the Russian Empire started to decline during World War I, so basically from 1914 to 1917. So that's why we're interested in looking at the 1913 year, because anything after that would be kind of unfair and not really representative, because it was in the middle of a very destructive war. Then the second one is the NEP or post-NEP figures of 1929. These figures depict the state of the economy kind of on the borderline between the new economic policy and the 5-year plans when planned economy was fully implemented. During the NEP or new economic policy, industry was largely nationalized, but farming was mostly still done by private producers, and there also existed a private sector of capitalist manufacturers. The main goal of the NEP was to rebuild the country after the devastating civil war, 1918 to 1922. At the beginning of the NEP, the Soviet economy was in shambles and production at a worse state than in 1913. That's why if you read Soviet stats, you often hear them talking about pre-war stats and pre-war numbers. And that is precisely because the year 1913 was, as I said, the height of the economy, because after that all the wars happened and the economy just got totally destroyed. So then the third category is the first 5-year plan, which is from 1928 to 1932. This meant the implementation of planned economy, campaign of industrialization, collectivization of agriculture. During this period, all sectors of the economy grew massively, especially industry, but also food production, consumer goods production, and military spending increased. The fourth and final category is the second 5-year plan, which was from 1933 to 1938. This mainly involved consolidating collective farming, the completion of the vast industrial projects of the first plan, such as the Magnitogorsk steel mining and steel processing complex, as well as the Dnieper hydroelectric power plant and massive things like that. They were completed at the end of the first 5-year plan or at the beginning of the second 5-year plan. So the second 5-year plan is when they kicked in. Also in the second 5-year plan there was a massive increase in military spending compared to the previous 5-year plan. And there was the new 1937 constitution, which implemented free healthcare, free compulsory schooling, massive improvements in education. The second 5-year plan also saw absolutely massive improvements in education all around, construction of thousands and thousands of schools, academies and institutions of higher learning, as well as building of cinemas, theaters and cultural institutions. And it basically marked a huge improvement for the availability of culture to common everyday people. In the Russian Empire, things like theaters and music halls were only for rich people. So first we're gonna cover some of the statistics dealing with agriculture. Cooperative farming and use of modern technology allowed the cultivation of previously unused land and increase acreage, basically. Area under crops increased both compared to the last Tsarist census of 1913 and also compared to the NEP figures. Although the bad weather conditions of 1932 and 1933 caused a temporary decrease, as you can see in these numbers. Now moving from the first 5-year plan to the second 5-year plan, you will see this trend of fast growth in the amount of land that's used continues and actually speeds up a little bit. You can see the reduction that was caused by the bad weather of 32 and 33. You can see in 31 the total crop area was 136 million hectares. And it decreased by 6 million hectares during the course of the next 2 years. but then it started to increase again, pretty much 1 million hectares per year, and it just kept on increasing. Most of the land was cultivated by collective farmers, while the remaining land was cultivated by private farmers and the state sector, as you can see in this statistic. Now, if you look at this stat, the collective farm movement that had existed in Russia since at least the 1905 revolution gained new energy after the October Revolution and fastened its pace even more during the NEP. In 1928, it became an official government campaign and reached a tremendous speed. The rate of collectivization in 1930 to 1932 was blindingly fast. Even too fast. Stalin actually said the collective farm activists were being quote-unquote dizzy with success and criticized them. From 1933 to 38, the speed was reduced to a more manageable rate. The amount of food crops produced increased tremendously during both 5-year plans, as did the production of industrial crops. For the sugar beet farming sector, the 1929 figure still reflects the aftermath of the devastating civil war that destroyed the economy. Production increased massively in 1930, but in 1931 and 32 the sugar beet sector was reorganized, which caused a temporary reduction in production. But in 1933 production began to increase yet again. With every other sector, it's just, constant growth. Now moving to the second 5-year plan. At first glance you might think that the production of grain actually didn't increase much. However, this is not really true. The production of grain increased both from the 1929 post-NEP figures and from the 1933 first 5-year plan figures, which were both lower than the 1913 pre-war numbers. Secondly, although grain production was only 118.6% of the pre-war figures, it was achieved with a vastly smaller workforce. During the 1930s, the USSR had gone from an agrarian country to an industrial country, and millions of people had moved away from the countryside to the cities, meaning that the amount of city dwellers that had to be fed was constantly increasing, whereas the number of peasants to feed them was decreasing. And not only that, but an increasing amount of farmland had been harnessed for farming industrial crops. Despite all of this, food production was at an all-time high. It was greater than ever before in Russian history. Moving on, the amount of livestock actually decreased during the first 5-year plan, and the reasons for this were basically twofold. One, the sabotage by kulaks and by some middle peasants under kulak influence. It is extremely important to note that almost all draft animals used to belong to the kulaks, and to a lesser degree to the middle peasants, and this is what allowed them to kill them in such high numbers as they did. The idea that is propagated by right-wingers out of either dishonesty or ignorance, that the killing of animals was just extremely widespread among the poor peasants, is a total myth, because poor peasants rarely owned many animals. 1/3 of the peasantry didn't own any animals at all, and the rest of them who did typically only owned one horse or one cow, while the kulaks typically owned dozens of cows and dozens of horses. So when you see that there's a big drop in the amount of animals, it's pretty obvious who killed them. The people who owned the animals are the ones who killed them. The people who didn't own any animals or owned very few animals couldn't have killed as many animals. Secondly, and this is maybe even more important, the breeding of the animals was done almost exclusively by the kulaks. So it took several years for the kulak animal breeding to be replaced by collective farm animal breeding. And during the first 5-year plan, most collective farms focused on crop production rather than animal breeding. So the reduction in the amount of livestock wasn't really even because animals were killed. It was more because animals weren't bred as much as before. Now, if we move on to the second 5-year plan, you see that the number of livestock increased as animal breeding was taken over by the collective farmers. So they started massively raising cattle and pigs and sheep and goats and stuff like that. The development of industry and construction of new machine-building plants greatly benefited agriculture. The number of tractors used by the peasants went from basically nothing to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. The Soviet state set up machine and tractor stations, MTSs, which supplied the collective farmers with machinery. So here you can see the number of tractors employed in agriculture. You can see that in post-NEP, in 1929, there were only 34,000 tractors used in the USSR, whereas only 4 years later, in 1933, there were more than 200,000 tractors being used. As new tractor plants were built, the amount of tractors also increased in state sector farms, so that's shown in this chart. And here is the same information for machine and tractor stations. The machine and tractor stations were mainly set up to supply the collective farms, whereas the state-owned farms typically owned their own tractors. And moving on to the second 5-year plan, you can see the amount of tractors used doubled during the second 5-year plan. So it went from 210,000 tractors in 1933 to 483,000 in 1938. So it more than doubled. And the vast majority were in the machine and tractor stations used by collective farmers, and the minority in state sector farms. Also, during the second 5-year plan, the amount of agricultural combines grew by a staggering 600%, and the amount of lorries by more than 700%. The amount of passenger cars increased by 240%, and other vehicles by an approximate 150%. Now, moving on to the industrial sector instead of the agricultural sector. The 1930s Great Depression devastated the economies of the capitalist countries, but had little impact on the economically blockaded socialist Soviet Union. On the contrary, the USSR was developing at a staggering rate due to its policy of industrialization. Soviet GDP growth at the time was the fastest in the world, as you can see in this graph. So notice the extremely fast growth in the 30s, then the massive hole left by the Nazi invasion in the Second World War, and then again an extremely fast growth after that. You can see the US, Japan, and Germany actually had really good economies during the war, but before and after they weren't as good. So economic growth was the biggest in the Soviet industrial sector. While the capitalist economy stagnated and collapsed, the USSR's industrial output more than tripled that of the Russian Empire, UK, USA, Germany, and France, which is just one of the biggest economic miracles in the world. This is the volume of industrial output compared to the pre-war numbers. So if you compare it to the best that the Russian Empire had to offer, it's almost quadruple that. And you can see that during the early portion of the 30s, all the capitalist economies were actually shrinking instead of growing. Germany especially, after 32, they started to grow very, very slowly. The USSR's industrial output doubled between 1929 and 1933. So here you can see basically the same information, but compared to 1929 numbers instead of 1913 numbers. So it was almost quadruple the production of the Russian Empire, but here you can see it's double that of the USSR's production of 1929. Now moving on to the second 5-year plan, you will see that during the first and second 5-year plans, so basically 1928 to 1938, the industrial output of the USSR more than quadrupled. During this time, capitalist countries had only negligible growth. So in 1933, the USSR almost quadrupled the industrial output of the Russian Empire, but in 1938, it had basically quadrupled industrial output compared to the post-NEP USSR itself. So at this point, we're not even comparing it to the best that the Russian Empire had to offer, we're comparing it to what the USSR itself had to offer before. Here you can see industrial output by sectors. The bulk was state industry, but a substantial chunk also belonged to worker co-ops, and a small amount to remaining private producers and foreign corporations with trade deals with the Soviet Union. So you can see there's total output, of which the vast majority is socialized industry. You can see the money amount and then percentage. So 99.9% of the total output was in the socialist sector, and 0.07 was in private sector, and 92% belonged to the state industry sector, slightly above 7% to worker co-ops. But we're talking about output in terms of money here, so of course the co-ops would be smaller as well. We're not talking about the relative amount of co-ops versus the relative amount of state sector enterprises. We're talking about the money that they're producing. By the end of the first 5-year plan, big industry had become 70% of the GDP, which meant that the USSR had become an industrial nation. Here you can see the relative importance of industry in the gross output of the national economy. And this is very interesting information. So you can see that in the Russian Empire, during what is considered to be prosperous peacetime, big industry was 40% of the national economy, whereas agriculture was 60%. 20 years later, in the Soviet Union after the first 5-year plan, big industry had become 70% of the national economy, whereas agriculture was only 30%. We often hear liberals and capitalist-minded people we will often hear them say that the Soviet Union only industrialized because of better technology and increased technology and increased technique, just developments in science, and it has nothing to do with economy and politics. But you can see how blatantly false that is if you compare the stats from 1929 to those of 1933. Because if you look at the numbers from the Russian Empire, agriculture is almost 60% and industry is only around 40%, whereas in the Soviet Union in 1929, which is almost 2 decades later, it's still roughly the same. It's 50% agriculture, 50% industry. Whereas only 4 years later, but under economic planning and under socialism, industry is a whopping 70%. It went from 50 to 70 in 4 years. Whereas under relatively capitalistic development, it went from 40 to 50 in 2 decades. So no, you can't explain this kind of incredibly fast development of society just by better technology. Here you can see machine and factory building compared to consumer goods production at the end of the first 5-year plan. During the first 5-year plan, construction of machines doubled, while the production of consumer goods increased by 60%. You often hear people saying that consumer goods were neglected by the Soviet Union at this time. They were not the top priority, that's for sure. The top priority was industry. The second biggest priority was agriculture, and after that it was military spending, and only then consumer goods. But they still increased a lot. Now, the early 30s, 1932 especially, was a rough time for Soviet citizens because of the bad harvests and the terrible weather conditions. Of course, combined with the Soviet Union's policy of maintaining a very strict economy and spending most of their available money, which wasn't much, on developing industry and infrastructure and things like that. It was a rough time, but consumer goods were certainly not neglected. And in the second 5-year plan, as was famously stated by Stalin at the time, life has become more cheerful. Which, you might think that that's just empty propaganda, but the same was noted by everyone who went there. H.G. Wells, the famous science fiction author, who went there during the 20s and then during the second 5-year plan, noted how much more easy and comfortable life was. So it was the first 5-year plan that was rough, but during the second 5-year plan, things went much smoother. While in the Russian Empire, most industry was involved in raw materials, mining, and especially cotton, in the USSR, machine building instead became the leading branch of industry. So here we can see the relative importance of various branches of industry. So while in the Russian Empire, industry was only 40% of the national economy, the situation was actually much worse, because the kind of industry they had was mostly involved in raw materials. Their biggest sector of industry at the time was cotton textiles. Some of the other big things that they sold abroad were things like coal and oil, whereas if you look at the statistics for the Soviet Union in comparison, you can see that the biggest sector by far is machine building. The second largest still being cotton textiles, and then the third being iron and steel. Just compare the relative importance of cotton in the Soviet economy versus the Russian Empire's economy. In the Russian Empire it was almost 20%, whereas in the Soviet economy it was 7%. So even the industry of the Russian Empire was basically based in agriculture. Now, can you even think of a stronger sign of an agrarian country than that? Then there's some statistics about trade and freight. So here you can see stats for national trade. There's a steady increase in the amount of consumer goods sold, commercial products being sold, trade between the collectives, between co-ops, and between state enterprises. Steady increase. And here's freight traffic. So freight traffic increased together with increased trade, and as a result of building of new roads, new railways, and new water channels. Now we get to education and cultural level. So according to the last Tsarist census of 1897, literate people made up a measly 28.4% of the population, while only 13% of women were literate. And among the rural population of Russia, the number was only 19. Most of the country was rural, and among the rural population, only 19% of the people could read. So that's terrible. For the year 1917, because there's no Tsarist stats for that, It is estimated that literacy was around 30% of the population, but during the course of the following Russian Civil War, the numbers actually decreased, as you would expect. In 1919, the Bolsheviks began the literacy campaign known as Ligbez, and in 1926, 51% of the population were literate. And by the end of the second five-year plan, literacy was at approximately 80%, being 72.5% for women and 90% for men. The amount of elementary schools increased by 4,000 between 1933 and 39. Amount of secondary schools doubled. The number of public libraries, worker clubs, and cinemas also increased. Before the industrialization and electrification campaign, most people in the country had never seen movies and had never had access to a library. But then again, what would they have needed libraries for in the Russian Empire, because most people couldn't even read? In this chart, it tells the number of schools built in the USSR between 1933 and 38, so in the second five-year plan. And you can see that they built a whopping 20,000 schools in 5 years. The amount of people graduating from the new Soviet higher educational institutions doubled in the second five-year plan, which you can see in this chart. Now we'll get to the last category, which is healthcare and life expectancy. So in the 1937 Soviet constitution, healthcare was guaranteed as a basic human right. According to the Tsarist census of 1913, life expectancy among the population was 32 years. Now, that's not very much. In the Soviet Union, by 1958, life expectancy had already doubled, in fact it had more than doubled, to 68.6 years. And from this diagram, you can see the very fast increase in life expectancy after 1937, when free healthcare was implemented. At the end of the Stalin period is when it peaks at basically 69 years, and it's basically equal with the life expectancy of the average American. You can see the life expectancy for Soviet females is actually exactly the same as the life expectancy of a American female. Male life expectancy is slightly lower for both countries. Then Soviet life expectancy declines, but then it comes back up again. Then there's some back and forth in the life expectancy of the Soviet citizens during the 70s and 80s. In the 70s it kind of stagnates and declines a little bit, but then in the 80s it comes back up again, basically to the level of the Stalin era. And while that's going on, the US life expectancy increases somewhat, so it gets to about 70. And then the Soviet Union is dismantled and the Russian life expectancy for both men and women collapses. And it's actually very dramatic that the Russian life expectancy has not really ever increased after the dissolution of the USSR. In the mid to late 90s it actually massively decreased, and according to statistics from the Russian Federation from 2012, the Russian life expectancy was 69 years, so basically the same as it was at the end of the Stalin era. Think about that. People say that Stalin killed all these people, but I mean, when the revisionists took over after him and there was the de-Stalinization, what happened to the life expectancy? It should have skyrocketed since, supposedly these people weren't being killed anymore. But no, it actually decreased. It stagnated and decreased. Then, when the Soviet Union is entirely dismantled, again, there's a massive decrease in the life expectancy. And now that things have sort of settled down again, after the disaster that was the dismantling of the Soviet Union and Yeltsin's capitalistic reforms, what does capitalist Russia have to offer? Nothing. It's not any better than it was before. Capitalist Russia is at the same level of life expectancy as the Soviet Union was in the fucking 50s. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, what happened to all that talk about better technology and all that? I mean, if we took better technology into account, then actually the Stalin era life expectancy is even better than the modern Russian life expectancy, because at least in the 50s they had some excuse, because they didn't have all the technological developments that we've had since then. Somebody actually told me that, oh, the Soviet life expectancy of 70 years wasn't actually that good. I'm like, it's pretty damn good for the 1950s. I mean, the revisionists who came after Stalin didn't improve it, but neither did capitalism, so there. Anyway, this was a very numbers-heavy and very stat-heavy video, but that was kind of the entire point. I just wanted to show you all these stats and things, because there's some pretty interesting numbers there, and I felt like I had to give some context to some of these to understand why the numbers are the way they are. I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and yeah, I will see you guys next time.